My name is Driscoll. I am the Digital Learning Director at the Bristol Warren Regional School District in Rhode Island. I'm also an instructor at EdTech teacher, and before that I was a social studies teacher in Connecticut for about 10 years at 2 regional school districts there. And my colleague Shawn.
Hi, I'm Shawn McCusker. I spent 25 years as a teacher, public, private, junior high, and high schools in Illinois. About 10 years ago, I got really involved on Twitter, and a friend of mine and I kind of created SS Chat. You guys are Twitter people? No? Social studies chat. And then we created one-to-one tech chat, and that involvement kind of got me connected with EdTech teacher, and starting this year, a full-time instructor for EdTech teacher. We kind of do work, we alternate between working with some of the lowest performing schools, trying to bridge the digital divide to teach them technology skills when they've literally just gotten devices, and working with high-end academies and such to kind of really refine their practices as well.
I really need to refine my wardrobe because this isn't the first time.
Like, we literally did not plan this. This is what, like, it's ludicrous. But it's an accident.
So we won't stand too close.
And we'll stop talking about that.
Okay, just get out of the way. No, this is so, to get to our stuff, can't read. It's Modern Civics Project / MassCUE MASCD. Shawn's a fan of QR codes, so if you want to scan that, works as well. But that site will have the link to the slide deck, and also it's embedded below there. And also, as we just started this project a couple months ago, as we expand and get more resources, more ideas, and curate things for teachers on how do we reimagine Civic Ed, we're just going to keep posting it to the blog there, just to help curate ideas from around the country in our travels and working with different schools. So keep up on that. There's a blog post sign up form at the bottom of it, but that'll have all the access to today's session.
So the idea of Civic Ed, usually when I go into a group, I apologize for speaking too much with a social studies accent, but since this is a social studies topic, I feel like I don't have to do that right now, which is incredibly rewarding. Next, it's great that we have librarians here, because I feel like so much of the things we talk about run through libraries in a way that we can't even understand how important they are. And I think it's incredibly ironic that at a time that we call the information age, we have started taking the one area, often of schools, that manage massive amounts of information and catalog it and saying, well, do we need it if we have Google? Right? So I was in Compton last week, and they kind of staged their waiting room as their library because they don't have a librarian. It's locked at all times, and they haven't checked out a book in 6 years. Right? But sometimes what happens is we focus on something new that is a positive, and we shift our focus away from things that are important, that we felt comfortable with. And then it's only later that we see that there are some changes. And we feel like civics might be that way today. I feel like I don't need to go into why we might have an increased in need and focus on civic education. Okay? I hope that you're with me on that one. All right? But we think that we have this modern challenge. If you think of all the initiatives that are going on in schools right now, what we'll notice is that there's this big trend towards work to focus on individualizing education, personalizing learning. But in a world of individualization and personalization, how do we then address a curriculum that is geared towards what we all hold in common? How we define ourselves together. Because in the process of trying to define ourselves as individuals, if we don't sew ourselves together, we're going to have wonderful little patches and no quilt. So how does one put that together into some beautiful patchwork quilt of all of our differences? Right? And we know that. I think that's there. But how does that look today in light of how things have changed? How can we emphasize beliefs that we share in common? Okay? So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is take us through some historical civic participation. And this is a very brief and truncated version of civic participation in like 4 slides and 4 pictures. Okay? Actually, it's 5. So first of all, let me clarify. We're not talking about a government class right now. I think a government class does one thing. A civics class does quite another. A government class teaches about governments. But what we have now is an emphasis on creation of civics. Civics classes are very specifically, if you go to the source Google and you search civics, the study of rights and duties of citizenship. And I just want you to emphasize for 1 second those 2 things. Ready? It's the rights. And we are highly effective at teaching about the rights of citizenship and people to fight for them. You should watch my children go after what they believe should be, right? You should see how engaged they get. I went to an elementary school where the kids decided that they wanted to change the world, and so they collected all the recyclables and all the garbage for one day, and they built it into a recyclable whale, right? And they named it, and that's their mascot for every single day. This is how much of what we produce goes into the garbage. And those kids went nuts using Tupperware and reusables, and they do, like, bring a plastic fork to that school and watch what happens, right? Because they got involved. So we do that, but I'd also like to think about for a second, we should consider the duties and how those duties are redefined. Like, I would suggest to you that informational citizenship is a duty now. But show me a textbook or anywhere where that was prior to the past 4 or 5 years. Okay? So, like, to consider those duties, but also to prepare them to exercise those rights, to protect those rights, and to exercise and work in those duties. How many of you ever had jury duty? Right? And if you're in a room and you ask how many of you voted and how do you have jury duty, it's almost equivalent. But I always talk about, like, when the civil rights movement, when the women's movement fought for the rights that they wanted, it was because they wanted jury duty as well as the vote. Because otherwise, you sit across a room of strangers and they pass judgment on you. It's an incredibly powerful experience. So let's go back. Back in the day in Rome, if you were a citizen, when you were young and you were a citizen, you came forward with your parents, they brought you to the forum, and there was a formal citizenship process by which you got your robes, and then you wore those robes. And as time went on, you didn't wear the robes every day, but when you came to the forum to participate in a civic discussion, you wore the robes of citizenship. And we knew you were a citizen and it meant something. And the citizenship was a carrot that they dangled to people who came in, like, if you serve, you could become a citizen, right? And so this idea of citizenship was exercised, this very formal procedure, these very formal clothes were exercised in a very formal way in the Roman Forum. And there was the big, like, Roman Forum, and then there were regional ones. And all you had to do to participate was be a citizen, wear the robes, and show up. In fact, one of the emperors, I want to say it's Justinian, but I feel like I might be wrong on that, got upset because he came to the forum and people weren't wearing their robes. And he's like, if you take off the robes, what you're going to do is lower people's respect for participation. And he started calling Romans, instead of saying the word Romans, he called them the people who wear robes in all of his speeches for the preceding few years, because he wanted formality. He's like, be a citizen, act the way, wear the clothes, do the things, categorize that, okay? But today, if you want to think about, like, where does civic participation happen today? Where does our engagement with the activities and the things that have to take place happen today? I think maybe this might be good, but this is a myth, because it isn't just our kids that are tweeting things. It isn't just them anymore, because people using technology today is you and me. It's these robes of citizenship. Because it often happens in between. How many of you ever retweeted something in the checkout line? Or shared something with people when you're at dinner? Or when you're on your couch? Or all these informal places where you let your guard down. You're not talking in your formal voice. How often have we as school teachers handled the what's formal voice in the hallway versus what's formal voice? What kind of a place are you in? Right? This is a hallway public place. Use this type of formal language. This is an informal place. Yes, you can talk the way you want to talk. In fact, one of the problems with people who are usually in low social economic status is they cannot transform their language and behavior between the social niches with which they perform. So that's something we have to teach them. Is this our modern civic forum today? And I'm not passing judgment. And I think we all want to shake our heads and say that it's worse. But you have to accept that this is where a lot of civic participation happens. But we think of this as trolls, but as much as there are trolls out on the internet, there are also people doing great work, sharing news. The whole student movement that was led in Florida after the Stoneman shooting happened through social media. This is all good things as well if we choose to make it so. So I don't want to denigrate this, but I'm trying to think this. Are you preparing your students to speak in this informal setting, in a formal public voice? Are we doing that? Have we had that discussion? So what Tom and I decided to do is take a look at civic education and say we must adapt to what's going on, right? We want to have the ability to look at civic education and how it's taking place in the country. And we found a bunch of resources that we're going to talk through. Stop us if you have questions, please. Because if this is just us talking, it'll get really boring. All right? So we went and looked, found a website, and I'll show that to you in a second, where you can find out what are the basis for most programs of civics. And for the most part, while many have moved on, the original purpose of many civic education programs, government classes, was simply, can you pass the US Citizenship and Immigration and Nationalization test? To this day, a ridiculous number of states, that's their standard. And the standard is typically, and I took screen captures here, you have to answer 30 of 50 questions from the Immigration and Naturalization test, and then you can pass and go on to the world. Good job. If your whole course is based upon 50 questions, how much time and depth are you going to spend? When you have other initiatives passing by through government. Have an exam model. Let's see, this one's a naturalization exam in civics class, but passing the exam is not required. You must pass the test to graduate from high school. 35 out of 50 questions. This is the basis for most American civic education. Is that enough today? Do you know enough about the Constitution to know that the branches of government are co-equal and what is involved in that co-equality of those branches? So then the next historical pattern, and notice that we're skipping some steps here, was that No Child Left Behind in our lifetime was passed. And when it was passed, there was an incredibly dramatic drop in the amount of civic education time that was given. When social studies was pulled from the Illinois state test, social studies education time fell off. Schools stopped passing bills to require social studies instruction in their senior year. Civics classes were taken out, moved into history classes, and they went from a semester class or a year-long class into a 3-week section during US history, typically after the Civil War. So how can we stop that? But also then, how are we teaching civic participation? Is it a lecture? Is civic education best taught through direct instruction, or what does it look like? So there's some research into what kind of strategies are being used. Write a letter or opinion to help solve a problem, right? 70% of 12th graders in this survey never wrote a single letter to express an opinion, never framed a single tweet in opposition to a concept to fight or advocate for something. 56% of students never took part in role-playing, mock trials, or dramas. This one hurts me a little bit. One of the most powerful experiences of my life is I went to a courtroom and watched a court case and watched a person get tried. Watched them deliver a sentence. And at that exact moment, I decided not to be a lawyer. I was lawyer or teacher, and I was like, I'm gonna be a teacher. Because I was afraid that if it was between winning an argument, which I love, and doing the right thing, that I wouldn't be able to back it down, right? Like heavy ethical things. So, but field trips, 53% of 12th grade students go through school and never take any kind of a practical field trip. So there are others here, and there's more in the surveys that we're going to show you. So this is from a Brown Center report about the state of civic education today, from 2018. While discussion and knowledge building components of civics education appear common across states, participatory elements and community engagement appear much less common, like way less common. So we're lecturing citizenship. We never do it. And I would propose to you that we've never been in a better position to do citizenship in our classes. There's so many ways, and that's kind of how we're going to focus as we go on. Civics education today still occurs for many, if not most students, through discussion rather than participation. Not just lecture, but we have discussions. We talk about it, right? We regularly talk about it rather than acting upon it. Like, words, not deeds. Have you ever heard this? Don't focus on what people say. Pay attention to what they do. And if we look at our civics classes, we are talking about citizenship, which is good, but it could be better. So we're going to move on and talk a little bit about modern civic engagement.
Yeah, so something that we'll address with what is the practical application, what does that look like in our classrooms? And as Shawn was saying, a lot of these courses have traditionally been about civic understanding, but we're seeing a huge shift across the country right now, and it's picking up a lot of traction, moving towards civic action. And how do we redesign these experiences so that students are actually involved in some type of civic action in their community around an idea that they care deeply about? And actually, the epicenter of a lot of this change is here in Massachusetts. And we'll get to some of the new regulations that came out this year. But I think that's a great thing. It's a great movement that's happening across the country.
Can we just acknowledge right now that this is perilous? I just told that Dave Quinn and I were talking downstairs, and he said, you know, this whole civics topic is kind of perilous to talk about, right? And as a government teacher who for the last 3 years was teaching government during the election through like the past 2 years of government tumult, right? It is perilous. Every article I bring up is a risk. So I stopped bringing them up. I only bring up articles that the kids bring up. Because then if it's controversial and a parent complains, I'm like, that child brought it up. I dove into the mess because they asked me to help. If they drive the news, if they drive the articles, you don't even have to worry about defending yourself. The students brought this up. It was important for us to get in and support them, right? So this civic action means this. Students are going to take action on processes, things, issues. That's where the perilousness comes from. What if they go into things that are divisive, that are politically charged? And then, do we have the frameworks to support teachers who say, I disagree with that child, but I support their engagement in the process, right? How can we support their engagement in the process? And I think that's an important distinction to make. So if you want, this is a mind-blowing, excellent report. The Brown Center Report on American Education, an inventory of state civics requirements. Within this are a series of, it's a survey of all the state's practices, a survey of the demographics and of teachers, and how we're getting our social studies teachers, and many, many, many other facts that you will find enlightening. It's 50 pages. It took me less than 30 minutes to read because of the graphs, the charts, and all the sources that are at the end. But if you want other sources, the back end of this has so many resources to read. I also say this with great respect for my people in social studies, that sometimes getting us to alter and diverge from our path, right, can be hard. To encourage that shift, but doable. So one quote here is, in the context of rising concerns over civic education, an important question is whether state academic requirements incorporate core components of rigorous civic education. And what the Brown Report does is looks at those states and says, here are some things you should be doing. Are you doing them? Okay? If you want to know what states are doing, you can go to this site. There's a bit.ly for civics by state. It's taken from the Brown Report, but it's through an NPR website with a scroll down. And when you click on it, it's going to give you this information. This is for Arizona. Right? And you get a sense of what they're doing. Is civics required? You'd be amazed at how many states do not require civic education. They just don't. Right? Oftentimes because of controversies that have come up. Sometimes because of fights between private schools and public schools. There's all kinds of issues that are there. So now just to take a look at a couple of different states and what they've been doing in the past few years, it'll give you a snapshot of where change in civic education laws are.
Okay. Was anyone involved here in the new civic education requirements or involved in any of these groups? Is anyone aware of it? Okay, there's some people aware. So these were all of the different organizations, many of which I'm sure you're familiar with here in the state, that have been advocating for the past few years to do exactly this, to revamp civic education, to help get it back into schools, but also do it in a way that matches up with what research says is great civic education practice. The Massachusetts change had a couple different requirements. So the first thing, and this actually just went into effect this year, well, it was passed this year. I'm actually not sure exactly if they're over to the room, but all public schools need to teach American history and civics education, and all public schools need to provide students at the middle and high school level with action civics projects, which is different. It's not just, hey, have a course and take a citizenship test at the end. They actually have to do something. Okay, they have to engage in their community, and we'll get into action civics in a bit. There's also some funding tagged to it. So there's the Civics Project Trust Fund, and that's primarily to provide professional support to schools and teachers that are implementing these new courses or trying out these new projects. Or if they want to use something like Generation Citizen, which we'll talk about later, it would defer some of the cost of using a program like that. And there are links on the slide deck with more information from the coalition explaining what the law actually means, what the funding is, and how to get access to the funding, if you guys are here representing school districts that are interested in tapping into that.
So far as Illinois goes, Illinois passed a lot of Change Civic Education prior to the 2016 election. And because of that, it's a great footprint for pre-2016 civic education legislation. What it did is it required a standalone civics course that could be no less than 1 semester long. It basically abolished the practice of squeezing civics into a US history unit, which is what had happened in many schools, in favor of reading and other programs. Our Governor Rauner, this is not going to be such a good joke in Massachusetts, but in Illinois we say he's the one who's not in jail.
Yes.
Because the previous 3 were. But because of that, it's unique because it doesn't have a media literacy component, which many post-2016 bills have a media literacy component in it. So you can divide and make that like a benchmark for where civic education diverges. In that media literacy has become something that's rolled into these. Now, the NGA, the National Governors Association, has some like template legislation that people choose from. Something like Massachusetts and what Illinois had have been coming from a template. Now that template includes media literacy. All right. Basically what it did is that it had a specific course content that must be included. And if you look at instruction on government institutions, controversial issues, service learning, simulations, that is all taken from something. So what you're seeing is all this legislation is going to be built upon a report that most people don't know about. And we're going to get to that core information that fuels that legislation in just a second. Okay?
And last one, super quick, just talk about my home state down the road, Rhode Island. They actually did pass Rhode Island media literacy legislation. So now it is a requirement now to teach media literacy in Rhode Island in the Media Education Lab, which some of you guys may be familiar with. It's out of URI. They created a report on best practices in media literacy, and so much of it overlaps with what we're talking about today. That's a quote from their report. So media literacy builds an understanding of the role of media in society as essential skills of inquiry, self-expression, necessary for citizens of a democracy. Me and Shawn see media literacy and civic education going hand in hand, but they're not separate issues, especially with the rapidly changing nature of media literacy and what it means and how to engage in civic life.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm a former English teacher.
Yep.
Civic and civics,
Yep.
2 different nouns.
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, civic is actually an adjective, and civics is a noun. You've been using the 2 interchangeably, and I'm not sure that
It's kind of hard to distinguish within all the literature how those things go. So on the bigger side, we have the concept of civics as classes and instruction, but also civic participation.
And a practice theory.
Right.
Practice.
Yeah.
It's a thing.
Yeah, we'll have to try and disambiguate a little bit.
That would be appreciated because
Okay.
I think the less clear we are, the more confusing
Absolutely.
we are for the kids.
Just as honest, we are working towards this project. This is the first time we're giving the presentation. So any feedback is
I
super
would be
helpful.
happy to help you.
Absolutely. And I can absolutely clearly see how that's an issue as you're trying to like whittle out all the strands of understanding this.
Okay.
Oh, by the way, just throwing this out here, Tom is being humble. Hey, Tom, who's on that committee for Rhode Island to write that curriculum?
I am part of it.
There you go. All right.
But basically, Rhode Island woke up, and I don't know if you guys heard in the news, but it was actually sued by a group for not providing civic education as a requirement for students. So a lot of the groups in the state, different advocates are coming together as part of a commission. We're coming up with another meeting at the State House March 25th, was to begin working on new state requirements in Rhode Island and support for professionals.
Civics education would be more appropriate. You're right.
And then we're actually bringing down representatives from Massachusetts that worked on the bill that was passed last year so that we can replicate some of it in Rhode Island, and with the hopes of collaborating more in the future so that Rhode Island and Massachusetts, whether teachers as professional learning or experiences, that we can share them moving forward, which I think is a really great opportunity that's coming up pretty soon. So what we're going to finish with here, we're going to go a little bit
What time are we supposed to be done?
At 10:25.
Oh yeah, we'll get there. Okay.
So we're going to go through some of the core instructional practices for great civic education, and also pair them up with some programs that we know are really high quality, vetted, research-based programs that you can use, online content that we think is valuable, but also some instructional strategies using technology that we think can help amplify civic education in your classroom.
So the first thing you should check out is this. It's called Guardians of Democracy, the Civic Mission of Schools. It was written in 2011. It's been updated a few times since then. But it is like the seminal work on how civics education should probably look. And within it is a lot of discussion of like practices that are used, how we can move forward, and research that shows why these practices work. Within it, however, are these 6 proven practices. I have to say, this is childish and immature, but when you read literature about this, they call this the 6 PPs. Which is like, really? That's unfortunate. But these proven practices are proven practices that you can employ. So a brief rundown of what they mean, which we won't be able to do justice with them in such a short period of time, but classroom instruction talks about having mandated classroom instruction, right? Like specific instruction. You have a law class, you have a government class. Law class is another one that got pretty much wiped out in many places during No Child Left Behind because there was such that emphasis on literacy, science, math, STEM. Okay, discussions of current events and controversial issues. Because of the current situation that's going on, teachers feel pressure to not often discuss controversial issues. And I'm not talking about just in classes within social studies. Across all of your classes, are you empowering your teachers in language arts classes to math and science to address controversial issues within the framework of their work? And that's the place where there has been like a truncation of those conversations, right? Outside of the core competency areas, the pressure to turn off those conversations because it's perilous has been great. Service learning, but not service learning in the old sense of service learning. When I was in high school, I had to do a service learning project that involved going and being the coffee service for a retirement home. And not that there's no value in that. When we talk about service learning, we're talking about having a project envisioned, created, and driven through your sense of need. Like that school that I told you about in San Diego, Design 39, that said, if we collected all of these recyclables and we put it together as a visualization, what would that change in us? And the older students came up with this idea. They involved the younger students, and I'm not kidding, pull out a plastic fork, and they will come at you. Use a straw when you could just not use a straw. And they'll say, you realize that you had the option not to. And they'll have a nice conversation with you. But that kind of engagement is what they mean by service learning. Extracurricular activities, things like the
model you might
We the People, right? Those are great examples of that. I think this is a big one. Student participation in school governments. There's a slide next that I couldn't help but throw in. Very often, student government, that we call student government, is a party planning committee. You're choosing the theme for Under the Sea and like A Night in the Tropics, like whatever it is that comes over all the Disney movies again and again and again. But is that government? Do they have legitimate agency over choices and policies? Do they have some kind of ability to connect with that? And also simulations of democratic processes. Are you putting them through a Congress simulation? Are you putting through building law? Okay, if you go on to the next one, this is what I think of. I feel like sometimes, if you've ever watched The Office, the party planning committee is about, like they take on the weight, they make it all serious, but we're really just asking them to put up streamers and balloons. And can we do better? I think there's more depth. There's a place where we could do so much right now to improve how we engage our students, okay? But then there's also something that we call the 4 complementary practices. This is an amazing article, if you want to go back to that. This is from an article called The Republic is Still at Risk, and Civics is part of the solution. It's a compilation by, you name it, Tufts, iCivics, the McCormick Foundation, which is a heavy hitter in this field as well. And it adds 4 complementary practices. Go ahead. News, media literacy, action civics, social emotional learning, and school climate reform. But not just having social emotional learning, not just having school climate reform, but engaging students in it. Are you asking your students how they can act to improve school climate? Are you giving them and empowering them to lead and govern in those senses? School climate, social emotional learning, are they on the decision-making bodies to be a part of that? Otherwise, you're saying, having teachers get together and be like, how can we make life better for the kids? And you know what we end up coming up with? When teachers run those things, often, things like hot chocolate mornings are a key part of those discussions, rather than saying, what if we had actual places where I could charge my Chromebook so I don't get in trouble over the course of the day because I'm so stressed out. I don't do homework at lunch because it needs to not die before X time during the day. Little things like that they might be able to engage with. Okay? So that brings us to the challenge of media literacy. I'm going to go very quickly through this section because this is where we'll pick up a little time going on. Some facts that you can read. Pew Research has so much information. If you're looking at media literacy in your school, go there, find that. 64% of Americans get their news from just one social media site. Also, there's a bias. We're all thinking, what can we do for the kids? And I think we should be thinking, what can the kids do for society to help us understand this? Because next fact,
Can I ask a question?
yes, ma'am.
Sorry, I know you're trying to get through the.
No, we've been stopping your question.
My question has to do with, so it's themed off of what we heard this morning about team approach
Yep.
and being able to cultivate environment structurally that can handle interdisciplinary work.
Sure.
So in your experience of working in your own schools and doing this work, what are some recommendations of how structurally within a school we can make this happen, not just in a civics course, but thinking
Great
in
question.
terms of like service learning across the board, because like there are so many different subjects
Right.
in this room, and that's a constant challenge that we encounter at the middle school is how to really leverage the team model we have in place
Right.
to really do this work and
Yeah.
not on a surface level of saying, you know, we do interdisciplinary work because the kids are working on the same project in
Yeah.
two classes. So it's a heavy question, but I think this all is very useful because it's something that's in the
Right.
forefront of all of our minds right now, moving into the next
Right.
year. But just thinking of how we make this happen in a real way.
I think you seize upon a theme that runs throughout all of this data, and why we're not gearing this class just for social studies teachers.
Yeah.
If you want this to happen, it has to occur across curriculum,
Right.
right? And so oftentimes service learning has to be a component that each subject area can foster a piece of the service learning
So how
project.
does your school do that? You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
you guys have common planning time that you dedicate specifically to a service learning project, or
My last
is it,
school?
is it a year-long project, or, you know what I'm saying? Like, just the logistics of it, so to make some of this like real.
I can't give you an answer that's gonna satisfy and be like an action step.
That's okay.
Because-
I'm like open-minded. I'm just like looking for recommendations.
Culturally, let me frame it this way. Culturally, how can you fit that into your school? My last school could not have integrated a cross-curricular, it couldn't happen, right? So they had groups, social studies and English can collaborate, can you make that happen? Science and math can collaborate, can you make that happen? Capstone courses, a capstone research course could be really good at it. Could you have a capstone government project that they work on across one curriculum, like over time, so that they begin that work their junior year, and then that process could continue beyond? Because that gives you the scope necessary to do meaningful work, right? That creates all kinds of structural problems to do it. So I have not yet seen a model that works everywhere. And my last school could not have pulled that off.
Yeah.
Like they just couldn't have, right? But when I
It's
find
okay. I'm not looking for like.
No, it's a great question.
Like a one-size-fits-all answer. I was just curious.
But you raise a key problem, which is how you can't do this in the social studies department during a meeting. You can't. So how are you going to structure it? I don't know exactly how that works, but I think the media center is going to be a key part of this, right? As a hub, as those places become workspaces and collaboration spaces, yes, I think that's the way to do it, right?
You know, one other quick note is that in our middle school, we have a new course called Inquiring Minds, and it's to try to test out project-based learning, and it's based on the sustainable development goals, and just organically we're realizing what overlap this has with,
Yeah.
with civic action and making an impact in our community, and how we can weave that into other subjects. So I think project-based learning, design thinking as
Yeah.
instructional approaches are going to be
Yeah.
really key towards this.
Especially design thinking.
So I'm thinking if service learner and just line, I'm actually
Yeah.
working on something right now with that.
Yeah.
Take a look at design.
Yeah, 'cause
In
that-
fact, when we do, we're putting together a summer workshop for civic education that's going to go through these best practices and employ different tools. And when it comes to defining those service learning projects, we're going to talk about design thinking as the engine to derive the work that they're going to do
Is
forward.
it kind of taking like an engineering
It's
approach?
from the
Yes.
business world.
Absolutely.
It's being modeled into the educational world and stuff.
Okay.
It's a way of making
Right.
things happen.
But it's also beautiful because
BSC's
it's,
doing a lot on it now too, so we
Yeah.
look at a lot of BSC.
it's also beautiful as a model because then they're going to go off into the workforce and use similar practices to address real workplace issues, okay? So go ahead,
Okay,
let's
so
skip
we,
forward to.
So we have 5 minutes, 4 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you guys some of the resources we have in here. You guys have the link to it. And then we can maybe open it for some discussions. But what I did want to show you guys is some of the different programs that are out there that I think are really high quality. One of them is Project Citizen through the Center for Civic Education. That's something that I taught with my students. I loved it. Has a great framework. Has anyone here used Project Citizen? Okay, so good program.
I did it in high school as a student.
As a student.
And then
That's awesome.
I used it as a teacher. I love it.
Excellent, yeah. Incredible program, especially if, sometimes I would actually do this as like a 6-week or 8-week section of a class. Great work. Generation Citizen, actually there's an interesting backstory there, but they're very connected to Project Citizen, but they really take it to that next level. They provide a ton of support. They're based out of Brown University, but now they're national. They're all over the place. But Generation Citizen is another great, and they're actually involved with a lot of this work in the 2 states. So
They partner now with Primary Source, which is
Okay.
another organization that out there, which we
Mhm.
use and we love,
Okay.
Primary Source. But now they're partnered with us.
excellent. Yeah, I mean, they're partnering with a lot of people right now. So I would say those are 2 great organizations to check out. Like you were talking about PBL and design thinking, if you're looking for different models for that, I love the New Tech Network model, which they mentioned this morning. And that kind of is a nice visual of how do you go from that traditional unit with a project at the end to a PBL unit. And I could see this working really well with like an Action Civics class, so that you start out with your project launch, they figure out what is the driving question or the problem that they're going to solve, and then you just redesign your units. You don't have to like get rid of stuff. You just redesign it in a way that it's more authentic, and they have that project at the end. And then design thinking, which we just mentioned, that's the other idea. You could use this protocol as well. They work hand in hand, but those are 2 approaches if you were to design your Action Civics program. The other couple things I'm going to show are some simulations, because that's another part of it. How do we get them involved in simulations? The one that I love to do with my kids. These are actually some pictures of my classes in Connecticut. We had a senator, our local representative, come in, do some mock congressional hearings with the kids. I actually did it as a student. Our team won in Rhode Island, went down to DC, and I probably
What year did you
against
win in
you.
Rhode Island?
That's what I'm about to say. I'm showing how what a pup I am, but 2002.
Oh, okay.
And then down there.
96 champ record.
There you go. So 96 champion.
I know you have
2002.
loyalty. Wow.
That's right. What state though?
Rhode Island.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. What town?
West Warwick.
Clearly, you guys are gonna have to chat after these conversations. Look at that.
We're actually
There's like a bond happening.
We're both wizards. We
Yeah.
find out.
Oh,
Can I throw this out too, not to change the subject here, but see how we have this simulations of real civic activities? Can I also just suggest that you can do real civic activities? So we had the city, where my school was, call us and say, hey, we have a proposition for you. We're redesigning the downtown. We'd love kids to come and look at our designs. And you know what they figured out? The kids figured out there were no places to park their bikes, put their skateboards, which aren't allowed in the store, so that's why they didn't go downtown. And that's a huge amount of money that would flow into the downtown. So they helped the city completely redesign to include the modes of transportation that they used, and part of their discussion led to them deciding to build another parking structure. So that kind of, like, it can be a simulation, but it could be real too, on top of all of it.
Yeah, it can lead to real change. If you guys are middle school, actually, we the Peoples and currently designing that units, actually whole courses using that curriculum that align to the new Massachusetts frameworks that include simulations and Action Civics and a lot of these things. So that link is actually to that draft that just came out last week if you're interested. All right, rapid fire, you guys have probably seen some of this. iCivics is incredible online simulations. I love using them, they're fun. If you haven't checked that out, definitely do. It's actually based out of a group started by Sandra Day O'Connor. Really high quality content in there, and they even have curriculum resources that go with the simulations.
Great discussion starters too.
Yeah, excellent online simulations. One that not many people are familiar with, but Mission US is another one. If weaving in US history into some of the civic ed for context, live simulations are really, I think that PBS Learning Media created that one that's really high quality. And then just some other technology I just want to talk about. A lot of you guys have probably heard of blended learning, personalized learning, flipped learning, all of those things. The whole point is that how can we leverage a lot of this digital content to redesign our classrooms? Some people do like a playlist approach, some people flip their classrooms, some people do station rotation. The whole point is that there's a lot of content out there that we can pull into our civics classes. A lot of it's existing. Does anyone use like the crash course videos? Okay, so the crash
new
course
series, the new Civic series that just came out is
yeah,
great.
it's awesome. So they have a really cool, some kids, I mean, it depends on the type of kid, but that's there. You can create your own content. I just put a link in there to me and a fellow social studies here. We just made a ton of flip videos on civics. We just created our own. So there's a playlist there if you want to check that out. There's a couple guys that make big, like Hip Hughes history. He makes a lot of civics videos. So curate that online stuff, but think about how you can redesign your class with it. And then when you have kids engaging in the community with Action Civics projects, here are just a couple tools that are really easy to do that. Flipgrid, Google Hangouts, Skype, excellent ways for them to connect with the community. Just some platforms that I would definitely use to do that type of work. And then if they're creating products, they're creating visuals, this is kind of like a cheat sheet for what we consider really high power creation tools. So
It's a
really
template to
Yeah.
grant them voice,
Yeah.
right? Rather than talking to them, if they're starting to create their beliefs and understandings, put them out to the public, they'll refine that, and that refining them helps them to find their political identity. We think that's a really good aspect of this.
Yeah, if just like a quick cheat sheet of it, these two are if they want to make podcasts and audio, Spark and Canva if they want to make visuals, and then iMovie and video for video creation. Okay, so that's kind of a rapid fire finish.
Okay, but,
yeah.
so again, I'd like to coming back to the same idea. In a world where personalized and individualized is the trend and the norm within our institutions, we have to make sure that we don't lose track of this opposite but super important thing, what is it that sews us and ties us together? What are the values that we hold in common? So we think that it's important to start talking about where can you begin in your school. And we think if your answer gravitates towards just one department, then what we need is something bigger, right? If you want to talk about what we hold in common, I think we need as an institution, a school, to bring the schools together. So one of the things we hope to do this summer is to have some discussion about what are the models that we can construct in order to create that movement, that understanding, and to answer questions like you raised, which is such a great question, like how do you make that practically work so that people can work together, right?
We do have a couple things coming. Shawn's running, if you're anybody in your district, he's doing a 2-day strand up in Vermont on digital citizenship and civic ed. I'm doing one on deeper learning. We have a strand on entrepreneurship, and then I think special needs populations. We also have summer workshops. We're both running civic ed ones, Boston and San Francisco and Chicago. So those are also there if you guys want to check it out and come to some other events. All right, well, thank you guys. We'll be here throughout the day and reach out anytime.